Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. So a tradition on this podcast since the beginning has been to add a bonus episode at the end of the season just for you all and for our supporters. I will let Natalie, who hosts this bonus episode, introduce it, but I just wanted to take a second to say thank you to all of our Patreon members who make this show possible. Some of you have been supporting us for 4 or 5 years now. It's wild and we love you for it, so thank you. And if you have not already, but you appreciate this work, check it out at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I also hope you will show some of our show sponsors some love for making our work possible, because it makes a huge difference that these small farm-based companies are willing to sponsor our work. But this episode is for you all. So without further ado, your official Season 5 bonus episode.
Hi again, it's Natalie. Welcome to my last episode of this season of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. I want to thank Farmer Jesse, Farmer Jackson, and the whole crew at the podcast for giving me the mic and so much freedom. It's been fun, and if you've learned even a fraction of what I have, then I'll call it a win. I am thrilled to bring you this episode with Tatiana Schreiber of the Rich Earth Institute. We focus mainly on her work there investigating the social aspects of dry sanitation systems. Translation, in case you don't know what a dry sanitation system is. Basically, how do people feel about using human urine as fertilizer? You might be thinking, how could I even broach this topic after devoting a whole episode to PFAS and how the use of biosolids has led to contamination of soils that we are only beginning to understand? I encourage you to listen to this conversation. Not all human waste is created the same, and if we care about big picture sustainability, this is something we really need to talk about. In addition to her work with the Rich Earth Institute, Tatiana has a small farm in Vermont, consults with people on dual-use solar agricultural projects, and teaches agroecology. In other words, she's awesome. All right, well, welcome, Tatiana, to the podcast. You have done so many interesting things in your life, and I think we could talk for a very long time. But today I want to focus on your work with, mostly with your work with the Rich Earth Institute. So could you tell us a little bit about how your journey and how you got there, and what you currently do with the Rich Earth Institute?
Sure. So I went to graduate school at Antioch I started there in, I think, 2000, actually it was 1995, in an environmental studies program. I was very interested in agriculture and the connections between agriculture and the environment. And I did my graduate research work in Mexico with coffee and cacao farmers. So I got very interested in agroecological thinking and also in sort of traditional agricultural methods that the farmers there were using, agroforestry methods with the coffee and the cacao, and how those could be very positive ways of sustaining ecosystems and habitat for wildlife and other species. So came back after doing all my work in Mexico to the U.S., finished my graduate degree, and I've been teaching in agroecology at colleges around here, and also having a small farmstead of my own where I sell organic seedlings for heirloom varieties of eggplants, peppers, and tomatoes, and really trying to encourage the sustenance of these heirloom varieties. But anyway, I've also been working as a journalist throughout that time. I had been working as a freelance journalist and focusing a lot on agriculture, health, environment issues. And so while doing that, I did a piece about peak phosphorus, the idea that we might run out of phosphorus. And I interviewed for that. I had heard about Abe Noe Hayes, who was one of the founders of the Rich Earth Institute, and the work that they were doing with reusing human urine as a resource. And so I interviewed Abe about peak phosphorus, wondering if, reusing human urine might be a way of harvesting the phosphorus in urine and addressing this peak phosphorus issue. So that's how I learned about the organization. And then some changes in my life. I had some extra time, and sought out the Rich Earth Institute to see if they needed a board member. And I joined the board of Rich Earth for 3 years. And then because I was very supportive of what they were doing and wanted to support it in some way. And my background, my academic degree was then in environmental anthropology, which is basically looking at the interaction of people and the environment and cultures. And so I wanted to bring that lens to the Rich Earth Institute. So that's what I did. And then when Rich Earth got a large grant from the National Science Foundation for a project, I joined the staff as a social research person. So that's how I got involved with Rich Earth.
Great. So there are two things I want to back up a little bit and talk more about. One is just sort of broadly, I guess I didn't ask, what does the Rich Earth Institute do? And then the second is if you could talk just a little bit more about this peak phosphorus question.
Right. So Rich Earth, I will read from the website, our website. The mission is Rich Earth Institute engages in research, education, and technological innovation to advance the use of human waste as a resource. And the vision of the organization is a world with clean water and fertile soil achieved by reclaiming the nutrients from our bodies as elements in a life-sustaining cycle. I was actually on the board when we came up with this vision and mission statement. So we did a lot of crafting to come up with that. But so basically that's the orientation. And the focus was on urine rather than both urine and feces when the organization started in 2012, primarily because it just was easier. It's easier to address the topic of urine. It has less problematic components in terms of pathogens and that sort of thing. So, so it just seemed easier to address. But actually now the organization is trying to move towards fully utilizing both urine and feces. But in terms of the peak phosphorus, the idea is that although we have a lot of phosphorus on the planet, it's tied up in places that are hard to access. It's, under the sea. Phosphorus that we use on the land often goes into waterways and then ends up as sediment deep on the ocean floor. Is hard to access. And then the land sources of phosphorus are, some of them are located in countries where there's a lot of political conflict, and one of the sources in the U.S. is in Florida, and there's a lot of issues with mining of phosphorus, very environmentally harmful or worrisome in terms of creating these sinkholes that can be very dangerous, and also releasing some toxic materials. So it isn't really an issue of us running out of phosphorus, but it's more that the accessibility of it is getting more difficult. And as I'm sure most of the listeners to this program know, phosphorus is a key element that's needed by all plants and all humans to survive. So it's very important. And so urine is a good source of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It's much higher in nitrogen than phosphorus. The NPK analysis is something similar to something like 11.5 nitrogen to 1.7 phosphorus to 4 potassium, but it's very dilute. So it's better said 0.6 to 0.1 to 0.2. But in any case, so it's not a high phosphorus fertilizer, but it does have phosphorus in it. So, I thought that certainly reclaiming urine from the waste stream and using it as a fertilizer could be a way to provide needed phosphorus. But it's more often, thought of as a nitrogen source because it's much higher in nitrogen.
So I wanted to, we've already jumped into the sort of science of urine, and I wanted to take a step back and frame this discussion kind of from an agroecological lens. So there's a lot of discussion of whether in academia, I mean, I don't think, and also in sort of farming social movements about what is agroecology. And I think sort of agreed upon now that it is a science. It is, putting ecology into action in farming systems and a practice, but also that there's this social movement part of agroecology that I think is frequently left out of the discussions. But I thought that would be a really interesting way to frame this discussion of urine, because there's very much the science, which you've started to get into, kind of the nutrient cycling. But then there's also the practicality, the practice of how do we capture urine and reuse urine. And then there's also this major social component. And so I think instead of moving from the science to the practice, I think we need to take a step back and talk about the social dimensions, and that is your expertise. Sorry, just give me a second here. So I think of like closing nutrient loops as kind of one attempt to fix the results of the green revolution, and reducing this widespread synthetic fertilizer. But another legacy of the green revolution is this dominant mode of information dissemination, of extension. Like, we have the information, now we will teach you information. But you and your collaborators have approached this social dimension of using urine very differently. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how your approach to this has differed from a traditional extension model, and what you're finding when you're talking with communities about using urine.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that question, because when I was doing my graduate research in Mexico, where the heritage of the Green Revolution was really, evident there, and talking to farmers there, there was really a lot of, distrust of scientists and of, people coming in and telling people what to do, and sort of discounting local knowledge and experience. So I really got a strong dose in the importance of coming up with an alternative model, and a model of partnership, of really working as partners. And as again, as that's the tradition within agroecology, to really focus on what's called participatory action research, which is basically whenever doing science. To try to do it with and for people, not sort of to people, not to go into communities and tell them what to do, or that we have the best answer, but to really try to find out, what people's needs are, and then work with them as collaboratively as possible to do research that meets those needs. And, I would say that's the lens I brought to Rich Earth Institute. So I've kind of tried to make sure that everyone understood what participatory action research was, and help to make that the way that we do research at Rich Earth. So I think that was happening before I joined as well, but just to articulate it more clearly and strongly that was the way we wanted to do our work. So what that means is that a lot of our research grants that we've gotten a lot of grants through the USDA SARE program, Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. And SARE has a thing called partnership grants, which are great. They're grants that you apply for as a technical organization working with farmers. So you get farmer partners to work together with. So that's been really great, because we can then, see what these farmers want. And SARE does make an effort to make sure that, farmers are involved in shaping the research that's done. So That's been one way. And then to sort of integrate our social research into all of our technical grants. So we sort of combine the science and the social science, sort of hard science and the social science with all of our research projects. And so that means we're interviewing all the kinds of people who might be invested in the transformation of, the way we use human waste. And that when you think about all the people who could be involved in that, it's kind of like everybody, because it's
right. Everybody eats and everybody pees.
Exactly.
And poops, right. Yeah.
Everybody who uses, toilet facilities, or everybody who grows food, everybody who builds a building, who operates a wastewater treatment facility, planners, municipal planners, regulators, architects, everybody comes into play. So when we did that first project, the NSF project, we kind of brainstormed who all of these people were. And then we set about trying to meet with them and interview them and do what we called focus groups with them. But as we've gone on, I've kind of wanted to do away with the concept of focus groups, because a focus group traditionally is a way of kind of gleaning information from a group of people, and then using that information to address those needs. But it's still sort of, it's not really a partnership approach. So we've shifted our thinking to, and this may be semantic, but I'm hoping it's real in a way, to shift our thinking from focus groups to what we call dialogue groups, which is basically creating opportunities for conversation among and within types of people, so bring people together and have a conversation, like a facilitated conversation. So, that's what we've been doing. We've been trying to put that into place with all of our research projects. And your second part of your question was, what have we learned from these conversations?
Yeah. And I think I don't think that is semantic at all, because I think also just the context of focus groups, I know we use them a lot in research, but it always seems like you are trying to get something out of that. Like a product focus group would be, let's discuss, let's bring these kids together and see which cereal box is more appealing or something like that. And so I like that idea of a dialogue. I think that does really make a difference. And so, yeah, the second part of the question was, what were your hypotheses about urine going into these dialogues, and what did you actually find?
Yeah, and I will say that we're sort of, right now it's somewhat aspirational. I mean, we have put dialogue groups into a lot of the current grants that we're working on, but we haven't actually started doing them. So most of what we learned so far was what we called focus groups. But I did, I co-facilitated most of them, and I did try to ensure that they were sort of, free-flowing dialogues so that we could, hear each other. So what we learned and what were our hypotheses, I think we kind of assumed, originally everyone asked about, the ick factor or whatever, with use of urine as a fertilizer. And one of the key things we learned was that there really wasn't much of an ick factor. It was very interesting. We did many interviews and quite a few of these focus groups, and nobody really felt, that partly could be selection bias, that we recruited people to come to these workshops that were about using human waste as a fertilizer. So of course you possibly exclude people who were going to be very disgusted by it in the first place. But the people who did come, for the most part, were not disgusted by it. They didn't actually have a taboo against it. Again, in terms of urine, this might be different with feces, but in fact, some people, depending on their occupation and experience, were quite comfortable with it. We did find that people whose occupation involved more of a connection with bodily fluids were more familiar and more comfortable with it. Like that would be people in the healthcare fields or parents often, you know, so people who had more familiarity. But in general, people, once they thought about it and learned that urine has this nutrient value, it kind of just made sense to a lot of people and did not really bother them. On the other hand, a lot of people thought it would bother other people. They thought, well, it doesn't bother me, but it would probably bother so-and-so, my neighbor, or, I'm not sure what so-and-so would think. So we did coding and analysis of all of these interviews and focus groups, and we called that ascribed attitudes, that people would ascribe to others an attitude of disgust, but they themselves did not feel disgusted. So that was interesting. And that's among what we call sort of the general public. Among farmers, there was no concern really for the most part. Farmers being more familiar with using manure from animals, it just, it was easy. It is easy for most farmers to just think about human urine as a fertilizer. But they do have concerns about how their customers might think about it. So that was something that we, have taken into account and are still taking into account in terms of thinking about what sort of information do they need to be able to provide to their customers so that they're more comfortable with it? Or, do they need to provide the information to their customers at all? Is a question, because, most customers don't ask exactly what fertilizers are being used, on their food. If they knew that, cow manure was being used and that cows are often fed, antibiotics and other things, they might have, concern. So some farmers have said, I wouldn't necessarily tell them if I was using it. If they asked, I would tell them. I would be transparent about it, but I wouldn't necessarily advertise it, that kind of thing. Whereas other farmers have said, no, I think it's great. I'm gonna use it as an education opportunity, and I'm gonna tell, people what we're doing. And some people think that would be a selling point for them as environmental stewards.
What are the regulatory constraints to using human urine?
Right, that's a good question. So as far as we know, there aren't really any constraints if it's going to be used by a family, if it's not going to be sold, if you're not going to use it as food to sell. So for your own household use, it's not, there are no regulations as far as we know. But for selling produce, that's governed by different rules and regulations, and it's somewhat complicated. But the Food Safety Modernization Act for produce handling may address this, and that only applies to farmers who grow more than 25 or who have I believe it's a profit, although I don't know if it's profit or gross income of $25,000 or more. But if it's $25,000 or less, it does not apply in any case. But in Vermont, we have permits from our, Department of Environmental Conservation to use our sanitized urine throughout the state as it's called a Class A biosolid, even though it's not solid, but that's how it's classified. But because we've pasteurized it through a certain treatment, but I don't know. In each state, you need to deal with your own state regulations. In terms of organic use, that's another story. If you're an organic farmer and you gross more than $5,000 a year, and you have to, abide by the organic standards. The organic standards don't actually cover urine. It's in a gray area because the organic standards apply to sewage. So, material that's come from a sewage treatment plant can't be used in organic farming. But urine is diverted from the waste stream, so it's not going to a sewage treatment plant. So it's not really sewage. So technically, it's not excluded from the organic standards, but it's not explicitly included. So what we found is that most people who are certified organic do not want to use it because they don't want to jeopardize their organic certification in case, their state certifiers, felt more strongly about it. And in our state, in Vermont, we found that the state Vermont Organic Farmers, the state certifying agency, doesn't want to get ahead of the federal regulation. So basically, we haven't pursued trying to get explicit approval under the organic standards yet, just because it's sort of a cumbersome process to do that.
So to sort of sum that up, if as a home gardener, you can do whatever you want. As a commercial organic grower, it's gray area, but probably not. And as a commercial not certified organic grower, you may need a license to apply it that is not really doesn't entirely fit the product. Like saying Class A biosolids is a little bit weird for urine, but that's kind of the workaround. And that just demonstrates how unconsidered this product is, that we don't even have the regulations surrounding it because it just hasn't been thought about. We've developed this kind of flush mixed waste systems, and we're just not set up to use urine, which is part of what the Rich Earth Institute is trying to change, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And Rich Earth does have what is a gold ribbon commission that has been working on, has gathered people from around the country to work on these regulations and try to change them. But you're right. Right now, it doesn't. You have to, in each state that you're in, you have to go to your own regulators and see what they think about how it should be regulated in your state. But we do suggest that people, other countries are more advanced than we are in this regard. Sweden in particular has done a lot of work with using human urine in particular. And the World Health Organization has guidelines for the use of urine. So we recommend that people use the World Health Organization guidelines. And so for their home use in their home gardens, and they recommend that you can use it in your home garden without any treatment, especially if you're just feeding people in your same household, because there really isn't, any specific danger that you wouldn't already have from sharing the same household. But they do recommend to wash hands after handling urine or wear gloves. Apply the urine close to the ground, not as a spray, so it wouldn't be right on the leaves. And, incorporate it into the soil. And they do recommend to wait at least 1 month after fertilization to harvest crops that are to be eaten raw. And, again, I don't know how important that is. There isn't a high level of pathogens in the urine, but that's just what the World Health Organization recommends. And if it's to be shared by people outside the household, then they recommend sanitation, and it can be sanitized by storage for 6 months. They recommend 6 months at 68 degrees or higher, which could be a little hard to achieve, or you could pasteurize it, which is heating it to 176 degrees for 1.5 minutes. And Rich Earth is there's a spin-off organization from Rich Earth called Brightwater Tools, which is developing tools and technologies for using urine. And they have developed a pasteurizer, which they are selling. It's a small pasteurizer that can be used for different locations. But anyway, so but for your household, there aren't, it's not, we get a lot of questions about concerns about, if people are taking certain pharmaceuticals, they might want to be more cautious, especially if they're taking high doses of strong toxic drugs. But otherwise, it's not really a concern. So
so that brings me to another question. This is just such a big topic, and in some ways it kind of it's intimidating. I did an interview with Caleb Goosen earlier from MAFCA about PFAS contamination, and so that is an example of the government and wastewater treatment plants kind of selling a product that in retrospect was contaminated, but at that point, they didn't know. It wasn't something they were testing for. And so one of the things that your work has raised is that in theory, people don't seem that disgusted by the idea of using urine. But there's a lot of distrust. And I imagine that has probably increased since PFAS has become more of an issue in biosolids. So I guess if you could talk, my questions today are all really long. I think it's just this topic is very complicated. But if you could talk about how urine diversion differs from biosolids and even how it differs from composting toilets. And then what are the potential issues? Like, let's be very transparent about what are the potential issues with urine, using urine as a fertilizer source.
Right. So I want to go back to the, distrust, not discuss. That was actually one of the, sort of catchphrases in our paper that we wrote. But
it was very catchy. I liked it. Yes.
We thought distrust was more of a problem than disgust, but I wouldn't overemphasize the distrust. That we didn't find that people were just really distrustful about the use of urine. It was more that that's where their concerns lied, rather than in a psychological disgust. It was more that people wanted to be sure, is this really safe? They just wanted assurances about the safety, because they have distrust, not particularly about urine, but just about, like you said, about everything, about, about government, about how science is communicated, about, how corporations influence the scientific process and all of that. So those were the kinds of concerns that people expressed. But, they just wanted assurance and transparency, as you said. So that's what Richard is trying to do, is trying to provide the accurate information so that people can make their own decisions. And so we have done some studies with pharmaceuticals, because people do have a lot of questions about, because they know that pharmaceuticals or their metabolites often are excreted in urine. So they understand that, and they want to know if that's should be a concern. So Richard did do some research with a number of pharmaceuticals to look at this. And you can find that information on our website, basically what we've found so far, which was, so we conducted some field trials and some lab trials looking at what happened with pharmaceuticals. And we tested 20 different pharmaceuticals and 2 metabolites and 4 hormones. So 26 different compounds. And the results, basically found that although there are pharmaceuticals or metabolites detected in crop tissue, we looked at carrots and lettuce, because we wanted to look at root crops and a leaf crop. And they were detected in very small levels, like nanograms per gram or parts per billion. Plant hormones were not detected in the plant tissue. And basically what they found is that there were very, very tiny levels that were found. And the highest levels of pharmaceuticals were caffeine and acetaminophen, because those are the things that people use the most of. And the way, we often express it is to say, in terms of the amounts that were found, is that you'd have to eat a pound of urine fertilized lettuce every day for 2,000 years in order to ingest the equivalent of 2 cups of coffee. And in terms of acetaminophen, you'd have to eat a pound of lettuce every day for 2,000 years to ingest a single dose of acetaminophen. So the doses are very low, but that doesn't mean that they're, that people might not have concerns. But what we try to do is also compare what happens to this. If you don't divert your urine from the waste stream, it goes to a treatment plant. And at the treatment plant, they do not remove these pharmaceuticals. They go into the waterways. So, I did interview a wastewater treatment plant operator and was told this. I'm not sure if that's true at every single wastewater treatment plant, but most of them, their interest is in removing pathogens or, nitrogen and phosphorus perhaps, but not pharmaceuticals. So, you have to think about what's happening to them if we're not diverting them and putting them on the soil. So we're now looking at impacts on soil health because a lot of farmers are concerned about that. What might be the impact on soil organisms or the microbiota in the soil. And I think the general assumption is that many of these pharmaceuticals are actually metabolized and become, less problematic as they move through the soil, but and might have a positive impact on the microbiota because you're feeding them basically nitrogen and phosphorus and other elements that they need. But we're doing research on that. We have a grant right now that's including some studies on the microbiology to see how it changes when urine is used over time. So we're really excited about being able to do that finally. I'm really excited about it because we've been interested in that for a long time. As far as PFAS, though, that's a very important topic because, as you know, they're toxic at very, very, very low quantities, low amounts. So I don't know. I should have looked into this beforehand, but I don't know if PFAS, what level might be found in urine as compared to feces, for example. I know that, all of our human bodies probably have some levels of PFAS in them. So, so there could be a concern. And a new grant that we just got is going to be looking at using urine with biochar, 2 kinds of biochar. One would be made from woody biomass, and the other would be made from biosolids from a treatment plant. Because the thought is that, we have to do something with these biosolids. What would happen if we turn them into biochar? Could that reduce the PFAS or eliminate them completely? We don't know yet. There's some evidence that they could be eliminated through the pyrolysis process, but that's something we need to find out. So we're just starting that process now. But the biochar itself could then also perhaps play a role in filtering those potential contaminants from the from the urine. So there's a lot of synergies that could happen. So that's why we're exploring those areas.
And one of the main difference here is that with urine diversion, you are collecting that urine at the source. And so it's never getting mixed with anything else. And the majority of contaminants in the, flush and forget, which is another great term that you all used, paradigm, is that is getting commingled with industrial wastewater and all sorts of stuff. So biosolids are a very different beast than urine.
Exactly. And so, the organization, like I said, is interested in looking at using biosolids, biochar, because of the fact that we currently have this system in which all of our human waste is going to waste treatment facilities and is being turned into biosolids. So, what do we do with it? Because right now it is being land applied in many places. So, exploring this option of pyrolysis and turning it into biochar, and then using that and seeing if that is much improved, and could also be a source of soil amendment to improve and to sequester carbon and all of those other things that biochar may be able to do. But like you said, urine that's diverted from the waste stream doesn't get mixed with these other things. So the urine nutrient reclamation project that we have at Rich Earth Institute, which we haven't really talked about, but that's a community project where people bring their urine, they collect it at home, bring it to a depot where they put it through a little pump and we store it there. And then we use that at local farms. We pasteurize it or sanitize it and use it at local farms. And we use it in our research project. So right now we have about 200 people involved in that program. And a lot of farmers local farmers who are very interested in using the urine. We don't have enough, people want it. And we started a second urine nutrient reclamation project in another town. And we're interested in helping other people get this started, because this is a way to, reclaim urine, like you said, at the source, and it doesn't get mixed, and it's much less problematic. And it can be used as a fertilizer directly as is. Yeah.
Right. And I also noticed that, so Rich Earth Institute is in Brattleboro, Vermont, which you said is also known as the granola belt of Vermont, which I thought was very funny. And so there are probably lots of people clamoring to collect their urine and contribute to a good cause. But I'm wondering if you have any advice to people who aren't living in a granola belt. And then, second to that, sort of this question of, again, getting back to agroecology, and one of the key parts of agroecology is sort of locally appropriate technology. And so those are separate but kind of combined questions of how can you do things in an area that are both culturally and kind of practically feasible? Right.
So on our website, under the category called publication, we have a guide called the Community Guide, and it's a guide for helping other communities establish these kinds of projects. But you're right, it has to be it has to meet local needs. So, I would say that doing, some initial research with community members, maybe doing these kinds of dialogue groups in your community before you get started with this, to understand the needs and the concerns, so that you would know how to set it up in a way that addresses those concerns, would be very important. But to answer your other question in terms of different places, so in rural areas, there's more potential to use urine on the land, immediately nearby. Like I have 6 acres myself, so I can save my urine at home and use it on my gardens here, or nearby farms. But in urban areas, that's more complicated. There's no way to easily use it locally, unless you can, do it at a community garden, which some people are interested in doing, is, having urine diverting toilets at a community garden where you could collect it and use it in the garden. Again, you'd want to do appropriate conversations with the people who are using that garden to make sure everybody's on board with it. But but there needs to be more processing and of urine. You might want to have an on-site pasteurization system there so that everybody would be more comfortable with that. Or you may need to figure out transportation methods. And one of the things that Rich Earth is doing is developing concentration methods to make the urine more concentrated so it's easier to transport, because of course it's very high volume, so transportation can be a real problem.
I want to interject there, because I was reading about that, and I thought, oh, that's very Vermont, because the urine concentration technology is exactly the same technology that you use for maple syrup. So it was like, we've got these two options. We've got the reverse osmosis, and then we've got freezing it and pulling out the ice crystals. And I was like, that's what I do when we tap our trees.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that was maybe an insight that when probably in Abe's mind, when he was first developing that idea, that probably came from maple syrup. But so looking at different concentration methods. And again, that's some of the work that this Bright Water Tools is doing. But, on a large scale, for large scale systems, you need to develop the infrastructure for it, obviously. And one of the things that, the organization or the company Bright Water Tools is doing is looking at installations in buildings, at a building scale. So how could you, design the building so that you could collect the urine and, sanitize it, concentrate it, whatever you need to do, and then get it to places where it could be used. Actually, again, they're much more advanced with this in Europe, and in France, they have quite a lot of sites that are doing this sort of thing. And actually, a couple of our staff from Bright Water Tools are actually heading to Europe very soon for a fact-finding tour to kind of learn a lot about some of the ways this is being put in practice in different, in Paris, in an urban area and also in rural areas. So, but yeah, it has to be adapted to the location.
Oh yeah. I didn't include this in the questions I sent you, but I know that one of the things that Rich Earth has been talking about, and other folks, is that there are climate change benefits to this practice. And so this isn't just a question of, capturing, getting a good fertilizer source. There's all these ripple effects of the wastewater treatment plants and recycling the nutrients. But can you talk specifically about how reclaiming urine has some climate change benefits?
Yeah. Well, one obvious way is that the production of synthetic fertilizers is very energy intensive. The Haber-Bosch process is energy intensive, so that's a problem. And then also, when you apply synthetic fertilizers onto the land, there are releases of nitrogen oxide, for example, which is a potent greenhouse gas. And some other things I was going to say. Again, the work that we're doing with the using the urine and the biochar is basically trying to figure out, what are the most ecologically sound ways of using the urine that could also help sequester carbon. So, we're not, urine itself does not sequester carbon, but if you mix it with other amendments, soil amendments to help build the soil, then that soil can help retain that nitrogen and avoid these releases like of the nitrogen oxide. So reduce greenhouse gas emissions in application.
What about the water use itself in our flush toilet systems?
Yeah, that is probably a very, let's see here, flushing urine wastes 960 billion gallons of water per year in the U.S. Also, climate change itself is harming sanitation systems, because of increased precipitation and flooding and extreme weather. So that's affecting, septic and sewer systems, causing combined sewage overflows and all of that. So, totally, changing our system from a linear one to a circular sanitation system over time, could affect all of these different processes that all exacerbate climate change. We have a webinar that, so Julia Kavicki on our staff is the education director, and she has created various webinars that you can sign up for. And she has one specifically about climate change that addresses some of these things in more detail. But I think there are a lot of different ways that climate change affects the sanitation systems. So an alternate sanitation system could avoid all that.
Right. Right. And I think, there is the cultural bias towards this flush and forget systems. It's what we're used to. But I think there's a lot of parallels in agriculture with other cultural biases. Like for many years, there was this, and still some people hold this vision of these cleanly tilled brown fields as like the ideal. And that is slowly shifting as people realize how important biodiversity is. And, even this idea that in no-till, the residue is sometimes called trash. I think that's really funny. And
yeah.
the word choice that, we have these cultural ideals of what things are supposed to be. And so when it comes to a toilet, we have this idea that, it's water-based and we flush it and we forget about it. But it doesn't have to take that long to change that cultural bias.
Right. No, I think that's true. And, one thing that was really interesting is that when we had this, the New York Times come to Rich Earth Institute and do a story about us, and it was a very good story. And it was just amazing that once this sort of moved into the mainstream by having a big article in the New York Times, it really changed the conversation in a lot of ways. I thought it was very interesting that, there were, within a couple of days, there were like 500 comments on the article. And among those comments, various people would say things like, well, I've been doing this, I just never told anybody about it before.
Yeah.
And so that was really interesting to me, that suddenly by having it public in the New York Times sort of gave people the freedom to admit that they were doing this already.
Yeah.
So, I don't think it's that difficult. And also in our, interviews with people about what they think would help to create this transformation, it's often been suggested to, reach back to family stories. People's grandparents used to do this. And also, of course, look historically in other cultures where using human waste as a fertilizer was done in the past. It's not a new idea. It's just that we've sort of forgotten about it.
Yeah.
Or, like you said, we've kind of pushed it away into this clean fields kind of situation. But, it makes so much sense that very quickly when people sort of hear about it and understand about the possibilities, a lot of people get very excited. That was one of the reasons I joined the board, because this organization was one where people got so excited about being able to do something positive, environment. That in many ways is really easy to do. You can just collect your urine and use it. It's easy.
Sure. Yeah. One little bit at a time. Everybody can do it. I totally know what you're saying, because as I was potty training my daughter, I had this, she'd go pee in the little potty, and I would frequently, just take it and add water and then put it outside in the garden. But I thought, I don't want her, I don't want other kids to think she's weird if she starts talking about putting pee in the garden and stuff. So I had this whole internal dialogue about what does potty training look like, and what will she understand to believe about urine? So yeah, I think getting it out in the open is important.
So sort of normalizing it, and kids, I think we found, and we are also developing some elementary school curriculum and things of that. Well, we're developing curriculum for every age, but little kids don't have a problem with it. Once you explain that this is fertilizer, you can use it. They're good with it. So,
right.
We found that with the urine. We call them urine donors, the people who provide, the urine to our community project. Their kids are comfortable with it. It's really more like, again, the ascribed attitudes, what you think other people are going to think. So yeah, like you said, other kids might think your daughter was strange. So that would be a reason to, have a program in the school to talk about it and integrate it into a science class.
There was one, I did look through all the SARE grants that you all have received, and it's really cool. We also had, I interviewed some folks about the SARE farmer grants, and so yeah, SARE also has these partnership grants, like you mentioned, and research and education grants. They have all these grants, and they're one of the funding agencies willing to fund things that are, maybe others would think are a little out there, even though they're totally make sense and practical. But one of the projects was looking at using urine in conjunction with a high carbon feedstock like leaves, or you could use wood chips or something, to create a compost that has kind of a better nitrogen phosphorus ratio than manure-based compost. And I think that is something that would be really interesting to a lot of the listeners, because in the organic no-till production world, a lot of people are using what they call these deep mulch systems, where they're applying very heavy applications of compost to suppress weeds and kind of change the soil tilth. So can you talk a little bit about that, the potential of this other application of urine to create kind of almost a better compost product?
Right. I was just looking at that project, and if listeners are interested, you could find that on our website. Again, if you go to the website and you go to the Our Work section, there's a research section. And if you go to that and to the results section, you'll get the links to all of our SARE projects.
Yeah, and we can throw those links up so people can find them. Yeah.
So that one was a 2015 project. I think it was finished in 2016 or 2017. But it looked at adding different types of urine, both regular, undiluted, unconcentrated, and concentrated urine, and using different feedstocks, leaf compost and I think wood shavings and other things. And what was found was that the leaf composting worked really well. You're able to mix the urine in with leaves and create the leaves were very good at retaining the nitrogen from the urine, so that you ended up with a compost that was a higher nitrogen, but like you said, a higher nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. And that would be important because, at least in our soils in Vermont, in this part of Vermont, and this is different in different places, but in our soils here, they tend to be high in phosphorus. And that's not good, because if the plants can't use that phosphorus, it can run off and again get into waterways and become a pollutant. So, as most people know, so you really don't want to put too much phosphorus in your garden. So the extension agents here often encourage people to use less compost. And I know it's kind of hard for people to hear that, because as organic farmers and gardeners, we've always been told more compost. Compost will solve every problem. And so, but adding urine to your compost or to a leaf-based compost, because leaves, it was found to be particularly good. They were better than the wood chips, wood shavings rather. They were better at retaining the nitrogen. But another thing that you can do is there may be benefits to using urine straight, directly on the garden at the time that the plants need nitrogen, so that the plants can, take it up when they need it, and then using leaves directly in the garden as a mulch, because leaves were found to be such a good, so effective at retaining the nitrogen. So, using nitrogen throughout the season when you need it, and then putting leaves on in the fall is a good thing to do. And what else was I going to say? Because leaves are a great source of, nutrients, and also the added urine would also supply some additional, not just nitrogen, but also supplies calcium and magnesium and sulfur and a range of micronutrients. So that would be a really good thing to do.
Right. So that's interesting. Thinking about there are different ways when you've got this high carbon and high nitrogen products, you can either sort of apply them separately for their different functions or combine them into compost. And that's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Right. So basically what I was saying is that, there may be benefits to using the nitrogen in its soluble form, also because it can be, taken up very readily by plants. So it's a very effective, fertilizer in that way. But, and of course, if you do have good tilth in your soil, that will also help retain some of that nitrogen. And then the other thing, of course, is using cover crops, using cover crops or undersown crops, throughout the season. That's another way to retain that nitrogen, because the cover crops will retain it, and hold it over the winter, that sort of. So we kind of recommend, all of those options. But again, this project that we're doing now with the biochar is another way of exploring that, those combinations. And we have found, we do this thing called a community science survey where we ask people how they're using it, so again, on our website, there's this link to this community science survey. We're asking people, how are they currently using it? And we have found such a range of ways that people are using it in different mixtures, using it with compost or wood chips, or adding wood ashes, all sorts of things that people are doing. And those are all, good possibilities to, again, make a better nitrogen phosphorus ratio.
Right. Is there, I don't know whether you or anyone has looked into this, but with the concerns about pharmaceuticals in the urine, is composting a way that could potentially eliminate those compounds? Are they broken down? You mentioned, they're often broken down in the soil, or so we think, but does that happen in the composting process?
Yeah, so there I would be speculating, but I would think that is likely, because the composting process has these different types of microbiota, at the different temperatures as the compost is composting. There's the microbes that like the higher temps when the compost is most active, and then the ones at the middle temps, and the mesophilic ones, and then the ones that are active at the lower temps. So you have a whole range of different microbes that would be active at different times in the composting process. So, I think we can speculate that they would definitely play a role in breaking down the pharmaceuticals. Now, you still need to think about whether the metabolites of those pharmaceuticals have some sort of impact. But again, it's you're basically looking at putting it on the soil versus letting them go directly into the waterways. And we do know that they have a negative impact on aquatic life in waterways, because there's been quite a bit of research on that. I think, you're bringing up, lots of research that still needs to be done, which is why this organization still has a lot of work to do. We're constantly coming up with new ideas for research projects. And it's exciting. There's another report you can find on our website is we did do a SARE project expanding use of urine to new crops, where we trialed it on, because most of the research had been on hay, but we trialed it on figs that someone was growing in a greenhouse, and hemp for CBD. And of course, industrial hemp could also be a potential crop that could use it because they're high nitrogen using crops. And then sweet corn and flowers and, cut flowers. And for all of those crops, the farmers, it was a partnership project. The farmers had good results. They felt that the urine fertilizer crops did as well or better than their whatever fertilizer they had been using before.
Right. And that raises this other point about even OMRI-approved organic fertilizers are coming from somewhere and are not necessarily without contaminants. And so that's not to say, oh, everything's contaminated, so we just shouldn't worry about it. But it's just to say that there are trade-offs to using each product.
Right. And that's a subject that we have thought about a lot, in terms of having these conversations, that people need to think about, how much do they know about what's in their other fertilizers that they use? And ideally they wouldn't have any none of them would have any contaminants, or they would all be filtered in a way that they were free. And we are working on looking at, filters and other things that could be used to reduce any contaminants, because there have been problems, as problems in compost with contaminants of pesticides and things like that. It's terrible problems. So, for the 5-crop expansion that we had, none of those farmers were unduly concerned about the contaminants in urine, because they felt like compared to what they were already using, it was likely not any more of a problem, than what they were currently using. But different fertilizer suppliers do a different degree of analysis, and can provide more information about what's in their fertilizers. But most of them don't do an in-depth analysis of microcontaminants.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, certainly if you're using some poultry litter-based product, then the chickens are not drinking as much coffee as we are, or taking as much acetaminophen. But there may be other things. Well, I really enjoyed talking with you today, and I have been just. I don't want to say obsessed, but I have been very interested in the use of human urine for a long time. And so I appreciate that you all are doing the work, because I am not doing the work. I'm doing other things. And so I'm just grateful that there are people willing to tackle this, because while it is really simple, it's also very, very complicated. And in terms of just the complexity of all the different systems that we have and that social dimension. But I think that things are going to change, and I'm excited about the future. So thank you for doing that work. And thanks for talking with me today. And if you have any final thoughts you wanted to share with folks.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you. Thank you for doing this. And I would just say that I would encourage the listeners to, go to the website, look at the information that's there. If you're already using urine, to fill out our community science survey, because I think it's really important to collect this data from how people are actually using it. And that also will give us ideas for further research, what research is needed. So, because, if we understand that people are using it on X crop and it turns out to be working really well on that crop, well, we might want to do more of a controlled experiment to see. That's just a possibility. But in any case, also, if people have questions, they can write to us at the info@richearthinstitute.org. So it's Rich Earth Institute, one word.org. And, that's what we mean when we were talking before about, collaboration and partnership is like we want to do the research that people feel needs to be done. So if people listening have ideas, let us know.
Awesome.
Hey guys, please check out the show notes for some of the resources Tatiana mentioned. The Rich Earth website is especially full of valuable information that is practical and also inspiring. It's really good to be inspired and know that there are people working to change the way we do things for the better.